Well, turn to Revelation 17. Revelation 17. As you know, today we're going to tell you who the harlot of Babylon is, so I'm sure that's why you're here. So unlock all secrets. We will deal when she is destroyed, which really coincides with her identity in the next several weeks. In fact, 17 and 18, I've decided this shorter time frame that we have, I just have too much material. So we're going to take a few less verses at a time and allow us to do justice to the text, and hopefully that will help. So we'll be in Revelation now until 2020, but it'll be marvelous. 17, 18, and the first part of 19 really unfold the seven bowls. Because look what it says in 17:1. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke to me, "Come, I will show you," this is the third time in Revelation we're told this, "the condemnation and punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters." The text tells us that what we're about to see, chapter 17, 18, the first part of 19, is really about two individuals. That is the harlot of Babylon and the beast. And the harlot gives, some argue, she helps establish the beast's credibility. She certainly empowers him, and she's found, would appear in 17, the one in authority. But rather apropos with the imagery that's being used, she's the one being used, and eventually she will be destroyed by the very creature she's helped support and prop up, and that is the beast. He will turn around and destroy her. And we see all this occurring in these chapters. 17 and 18 reference this Babylon. So we have the Babylon, we've got the harlot, and you've got the beast over here. But this harlot or this Babylon, scholars have debated, and that they've argued is, well, we have almost two different distinct entities. In fact, in the footnotes, I give you a few scholars who argue, in fact, there are two individuals. There's a religious/economic Babylon that's described in 17, and there is a political Babylon in 18. And there are some differences within these two chapters, how the one appears to be destroyed here. I mean, here they mourn her loss, here they rejoice her loss, the kings of the earth. And so there seems to be some distinction. However, I don't think so. I think 17 and 18 are describing one Babylon, one entity. And I mentioned down at the bottom of your notes several reasons, and you can look at those, why I believe, no, we're not dealing with two. Now, again, there are great minds such as John Walvoord, who's now with the Lord, who has more brains in his pinky than I'd ever hoped to have, who argues that 17 and 18 are two different Babylons. But I don't see it. It doesn't fit grammatically. It doesn't fit contextually, etc. And I mentioned that to you. And the harlot in 17 is described as a city. She's still described as a political entity. And a woman is never used to describe a religious system in Scripture. Females are used to describe cities, but that is it, or nations. So I see 17 and 18 dealing with the same individual. So let's read. We're only going to deal with today. I call this part one. It's going to be part one of 12, maybe. But I want to deal with just the first 6 verses of 17 today. We will address who she is in a minute. Says, as we just read, that this woman, this great prostitute, it's interesting in the Greek, the word for prostitute is porne. Sound familiar? Porn, all right? She's the great prostitute who sits on the many waters. We've got some young people today. It's going to be PG-13, but here we go. So bear with us, but this is the text. She sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality, and the earth's inhabitants got drunk with the wine of her immorality. She is very grotesque. She's awful. She's influential. She's powerful. Don't miss it. It says, so he carried me away in the spirit, and that could be a small s or a large s. I think the Net Bible is correct. They render it with a large s, meaning it's the Holy Spirit that takes John in the wilderness. And there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Now the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet clothing. They look a lot alike, don't they? And adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held in her hand a golden cup filled with the detestable things and unclean things from her sexual immorality. It's the 3rd time that term has been used already. And on her forehead was written a name. And those of you who have the good old King James or the NIV, after mystery, what kind of punctuation mark do you see? A comma, yeah? You should see a comma. Do you see a comma? Yes. Yeah. Now, a colon, now I'm talking those who have the King James or NIV. If you have a New American Standard, the Net Bible, I think even the ESV, you have a colon, which is the better rendering. What it is the name, namely a mystery, Babylon, the great, the mother of prostitutes and of the detestable things of the earth. Her cup holds detestable things, and she is known as being detestable. All I can say is one long tattoo on her forehead. But anyway, I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints, namely the blood of those who testified to Jesus. I was greatly astounded when I saw her. Let's unpack this text and let's look at this. Obviously, the first thing we see is that she's labeled the great prostitute. Immorality and idolatry were often linked with prostitution, both in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament era. Our audience, those being in Asia Minor, would be very familiar with the guilds, the various organizations that you could belong to, and sexual immorality was usually linked with that, as well, of course, the pagan worship, etc. We talked about Corinth boasted of over 1,200 to 1,200 temple prostitutes in the first century. What to be known for, right? But they were just a free society. The great prostitute, this imagery of prostitution, as I mentioned in your notes, I give you several texts which you can look up. You think of Hosea, remember? The prostitute that he's told to marry embodies really Israel. Israel is known as a harlot. She's seen as such, and I mentioned that in your notes. But she's not the only one that's identified as a harlot. Nineveh, as well as Tyre, they are associated with such activity. Nahum, chapter 3, verse 4, says Nineveh is a mistress of sorceries. And Tyre, there in Isaiah 23, is seen as such as well. And I mentioned there in your notes, not only did these nations forsake the Lord, they were known as such because they tempted others and led them into sin. Now, I don't think the text is necessarily stating that this is and I even mentioned this in part 2, that it's a literal idea. In fact, Beale, in his commentary in Revelation, it says, refers not to literal immorality, but figuratively to acceptance of the religious and idolatrous demands of the ungodly earthly order. And that's what we see here, is this great prostitute is corrupting the globe. And she does it through economic power. She does it through economic influence. And she's willing to help you succeed politically if you're willing to lie in bed with her. And very influential, and ultimately we're going to see her demise. We're told, notice in the text it says, I'll show you this great prostitute who sits on many waters. This does not mean that she has a fleet of ships. We've talked about this. When you interpret Scripture, you want to look, because often the text tells you. You don't have to guess. You don't have to sit around and eat mushrooms and try to figure it out. Because look at verse 15. 17:15 tells us, the angel said to me, the waters you saw, where the prostitute is seated, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. She has a global influence. It's not regional. She is all over the globe. Her power is amazing. And again, very influential. And we mentioned this. It's interesting, this idea of fornication and leading people into it reminds me of a text, and I have it in your notes. It's Jeremiah 51. I want you to turn there. Remember, we've stated there are over 670 allusions to the Old Testament in just 405 verses in the book of Revelation. You stab the sucker with a knife, it will bleed Old Testament. If you don't understand the Old Testament, I would argue you will not understand the book of Revelation. That's one of the reasons why it's so complex, right? Because John is assuming you know not only the historical backdrop, but you also know your Old Testament very, very well. And so Jeremiah 51, I want you to look at this text. You want to talk about a bummer of a ministry, that's Jeremiah's. No wonder he's called the weeping prophet. Jeremiah 51, I want you to start in verse 6. Flee from the midst of Babylon, and each of you save his life. Do not be destroyed in her punishment, for this is the Lord's time of vengeance. Does this sound familiar? Now, the context of Jeremiah is the historical Babylon, the ancient Babylon that's on the Euphrates. But we pick up that title and hear this great harlot of Babylon, and we're going to use the same type of imagery. So what is it telling you? Her day is done. It's looming, just as it was for ancient Babylon. He is going to render recompense to her. Watch what it says in verse 7. Babylon has been a golden cup in the hand of the Lord, intoxicating all the earth. The nations have drunk of her wine, therefore the nations are going mad. What did Revelation tell you about the great harlot? Go back to the text. Look at it. Verse 2. The kings of the earth committed sexual immorality. The earth's inhabitants got what? Drunk with the wine of her immorality. Sound familiar? Jeremiah comes screaming through the text and says, look, she's just like ancient Babylon. And her fate will be just the same, as we're going to see. But she's extremely influential. And this is why some scholars argue it's more of an economic and religious entity, because she's maneuvering as pawns all these political kings and leaders on the globe. She's kind of some type of force that draws them all together, or influence, or organization. The UN, no, I don't know. But she's some type of entity that's functioning in this way, all right? Now, I want you to see a few things. Last week we talked about why Babylon, and I just want to review this. This is not in your notes, but it was from last week's notes. Remember the reason we mentioned Babylon being such a great name? Well, you tell us. Why is Babylon such a great name to be used? I mean, we could have called this the harlot of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the harlot of Nineveh, or the harlot of Tyre. Why would we use Babylon? What did we say? Why is this nomenclature so significant? I gave you one. Right here's the clue to jog your memory. She was known for world domination, the ancient Babylon. She destroyed the first temple, and she brought the Jews into exile. What's another reason why the name is so significant?
It's pretty rich and ostentatious, right?
Yeah, she was vastly wealthy. That was the second reason we talked about. Economic control and abuse globally. Sounds a lot like the harlot as well, right? What else did we say? The reason this term is so good. Yes? Yes, a very sudden destruction. She's known for idolatry and pride. We mentioned the Lord's swift and sure destruction. We're going to see that here in 17 and 18 as we move along. This is not some prolonged demise. It's swift. Boom. And she's destroyed. This is why we'll see in a minute. I don't think this is Jerusalem, as some scholars want to argue. Another reason we mention is there's a call to persevere. Just as the saints of old were told to stand fast in the midst of exile and captivity, so those that claim the name of the Lord at this time frame need to stand fast. And by the way, many will. In fact, as we saw in verse 6, many will die under her reign of terror. All right, so you see that in there. Questions on this? This is significant because, again, we could have called her the harlot of Sodom, the harlot of Nineveh, but no, Babylon is the key term that we're using here to draw this in. Questions on that? No?
Is there a tie to Babel as a Babylonian?
Yes. Someone asked me that after class last week, and I said, well, no and yes. Or no, I think is what I said. And yes, there is a tie. So this goes all the way back. And yeah, I'm going to show my cards. I'll hold on a second. Yeah, I was going to read a text, but I'll wait. Yes, I think there's a connection. All right. Well, let's move to then figuring out who is this harlot, this Babylon. And obviously, we're going to ask this question several times as we move through these next two chapters, all right? And it will help, I think, solidify it. But at least today, we can raise the flags, and then you can see as we sort through this who it is. Obviously, I take a futurist view of this book. I've told you that. So that's going to taint my perspective a little here, and I'll be honest there. That's why, for instance, the first view is I just totally disagree with. Those who hold to a preterist view, that is, that the events of Revelation occurred at the time of Nero or before it, at least 70 AD, they will argue that the Babylon here is none other than Jerusalem. I mentioned in your notes, and I kind of, if you want more, I'll be happy to engage with this. As you know, I have real problems fitting the events of Revelation into the first century. Even the mere fact of this immediate text, and I mentioned this in your notes there in the parentheses, there's a disregard for the global language of 1715. When did Jerusalem ever have domination or world influence in the first century? She was a backwards city that was where Roman officials dreaded it going there as governors. They hated it. That's why they stayed at Caesarea, which is still the only place for a golf course in Israel today. Why go to Jerusalem? Stay at Caesarea. It's beautiful. But they hated going down there. They hated the Jews. They didn't like the location. And so when did Israel ever have domination in the first century? I can understand if we're going back to 1000, you want to go back to BC, the time of David, but we're not dealing with the time of David, or not even dealing with the Hashmoneans in the intertestament period. So that doesn't fit. It lacks historical correlation. We're told that this harlot is suddenly destroyed. Yet historically in the first century, how is Jerusalem destroyed? It's a several year siege before it's taken down. There's a reason for that. Rome was having civil wars. After Nero died, they went through a few emperors before they could land one. And that's part of the reason. But nonetheless, it took several years before they brought down Jerusalem. And that doesn't fit. I also mentioned it dismisses the reference to Babylon burning forever and ever in 1903. I don't know how you can do that when you have a new Jerusalem. It possesses inconsistencies in interpretation. I love the preterists. If you read the writings, at one minute they're taking a literal interpretation, then they take a figurative and like, no, you need to be consistent here. And they could argue that with us, I know too. But I don't think they do. And it argues for an incorrect date of the book, which I just don't see. I think they're putting round pegs in a square hole. And so the Jerusalem, I strongly disagree with. There was an earlier strand of preterist interpretation that held that it was Rome, and they argue Rome died out in AD 410, which I put in your notes. And again, I have significant issues with. Another view, which was very popular in the 1980s, until Saddam was brought down, was that this Babylon that we see in Revelation 17 and 18 is the literal Babylon of modern-day Iraq. And the reason they'll argue this, such as Dyer, if you saw that book that came out, some of you, Charlie Dyer's book, maybe you've seen it. He argues that Babylon, the prophecies for Babylon were never ultimately fulfilled. And so we're waiting, and it's holding fast to a literal interpretation, which I appreciate. However, Scripture, as I mentioned in your notes, in the intertestament period have no problem using Babylon as a figurative term. Let me give you an example. Turn to 1 Peter 5. Now, they will try to argue that 1 Peter 5 is also referring to Babylon. I disagree. It says in 5:13, the church in Babylon, chosen together with you, greets you. I think that's Rome. I think that's where Peter's imprisoned, or I see that as Rome. Now, there are a few who want to argue that it's the Babylon of Iraq. It just doesn't fit historically. And as I mentioned, I've given you several intertestament Jewish writings that would argue Babylon can be used as a code word for Rome. Why? Because they both have brought destruction to Jerusalem. They both have destroyed the Jewish temple, right? Babylon did in 586, Rome did in 70 AD. And so the argument is the connections are very similar. So to me, that view does not wash. Again, I'm not going to lose sleep if you hold to it, but I don't think it's right. In fact, turn back to Jeremiah 50. I need to read a text to you. I believe it has been fulfilled, the prophecies of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 50, or at least the ancient Babylon, verse 39 says, therefore, this is God's words to Babylon, ancient Babylon. It says, therefore the desert creatures will live there along with the jackals. The ostriches also will live in it, and it will never again be inhabited or dwelt from generation to generation. And I could take you to Babylon today. There's nothing there. Same prophecy was given to Hatzor. And I love taking groups to Hatzor. A lot of groups don't go there when they go to Israel. But I love my colleague Rich. He has everyone stand on top of the tell, and it's an enormous tell. It's 300 acres. Just look around you. What do you see? Nothing. There's no modern city. There is nothing there. And prophecy was fulfilled with Hatzor as well, just as I think it is with Babylon. It's done. No one will ever inhabit it again. Which is an amazing statement, because you think about ancient ruins, many of them you can't really study because there's a modern city on top of it. Thessaloniki is a great example. All you see is a section of the agora. The rest of it, you got modern buildings all around. You either tear down the buildings to study the site or let people live and do their life there. And it's a tension, those who have these great archaeological sites. But anyway. So Jerusalem, Babylon. Another has argued, no, it's the Roman Catholic Church. Martin Luther rang this or espoused this view loud and clear. He had an axe to grind, of course, with the Catholic Church, and he even wrote a book about it. And he went after the Catholic Church and said, she is the harlot here in Revelation 17 and 18. Makes sense right in the 1500s. The Roman Catholic Church really did control the nations. She was a major force in the globe. She even crowned kings and queens and dictated what they would do and would not do. And if they didn't, send them to hell, give them the bowl, right? That's what was the era in which they lived. And where would Luther and others get this view? In verse 9. Look at verse 9 of chapter 17 in Revelation. It says the 7 heads are 7 mountains the woman sits on. So this is the 7 hills of Roma. So the argument is this has to be the Roman Catholic Church. Some will, it's a little insensitive. They'll say, well, it's some apostate church. And so this view is held by some. The problem with this, again, is that the harlot, even in 17, is described as a city. So how this fits, and we may have some Roman Catholics here, so bear with us. And I know there are believers in the Roman Catholic Church, just as there are unbelievers at College Park. So I want to be careful and sensitive here. It could be some type of apostate city religion entity. We don't know, all right? But this view argues that it's a variation or a form thereof. The last view is no. What we're dealing with is an entity like Babylon, like Rome, and it becomes a code word for whatever this system is. And I mentioned that in your notes. It's a powerful city that controls the nations through its economic and religious influence. She's more than just a city, right? Because she has some type of way of controlling the globe. Well, comments, questions, cries of outrage on this one. You're saying, well, which view do you land on? I'm not going to answer that. I will as we journey through 17 and 18.
Washington, D.C.?
Yeah. Someone said Washington, D.C. I don't see the United States in Revelation at all. So, sorry. I think we're going to be a non-entity. Yes.
David, in verse 6, it says, woman was drunk with the blood of the saints.
Yeah.
So is that referring to that transpired in that location?
We will get there with the drunkenness, but go ahead. I'll let you finish your question.
Well, only because if it's a physical location, then it would be city implied, or a religion such as the Catholic Church, if you will. And so I'm just curious.
I think the drunk with the blood of the saints, I think she's a global figure. I don't think that's a local. So I see this as more as a global onslaught. And her minions, surely, well, we'll get there in a minute. They also delight in taking the blood of the saints, because remember what happened with the two witnesses? What did they do? Gave out gifts and celebrated the horrific death of the two witnesses in chapter 11. So her influence has started from day one of the tribulation period, if not before, but she's on the rise, and we'll see when she is destroyed by whom later in our journey here. So, but questions on the identity of the harlot? This is not an easy task. And I told my wife I had 10 commentaries in front of me. 6 of them hold to a futurist view, 5 of them, and not one of them agreed on the identity of Babylon. So I'm not going to probably answer that because I don't think we ultimately know. Do I see some hybrid of an apostate church with some type of political entity? Yeah, I could see a hybrid of this. I don't see, number one, I don't see how Babylon or Jerusalem and then Babylon and modern Iraq. I think your hermeneutics is going crazy with the literal idea, but that's just me.
So Dave, to be clear, are you saying that it is a city, literally, but one that controls the rest of the world through economic and religious influence? Is that what I'm seeing?
I see that strong, yes. The question is, I see this as a city with both economic and religious influence. Is it kind of like the Vatican? I don't know. But it's a city that has enormous influence. And I am not saying the Catholic Church today is the harlot here in Revelation 17. We don't know what this will be, but it's something.
So one last thing, do you think the idea of many waters is strictly peoples and influence over, or has any application to the logistics of where the city may sit?
How would the city is located affect the many waters?
That's what, well, the literal interpretation is that it's a coastal city, because captains from the sea.
Okay, we will get to that, and that's a great question because we're told that it has a lot of waters surrounding it.
But on the other hand, the other verse says that those are peoples and nations.
Yes, but we know that merchants come to her, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll get there. Dr. Bruce, I didn't coach him ahead of time, or Mitch. I was going to have Mitch teach today, but it didn't work out.
Is there any, well, does it have to be one entity?
Well, that was what I started with this morning, is that some say 17 is more of a religious individual, and then in 18 we have a political entity, but I just don't, I think you're splitting hairs. To me, they're the same. The terminology in 17 and 18 are the same. It's a great...
Say 17, 18 together.
Yes.
Does that have to be one entity? Or could
Yes.
it be an apostate church, and then could it be an economic power?
I see we're dealing with
One entity.
one institution, is what I would argue. Yeah, I got two more questions, and we'll start.
What's the Roman Catholic response to?
Well, why don't you ask Martin Luther? I mean, I'm not trying to be cheeky, but to them, take Luther's books and burn them, and if you can get Luther, burn him with the books. So, I mean, obviously, they took great offense to this, and we would be too if you were told College Park was the the Antichrist of or the harlot of the future. Yeah, I don't know. Yes.
David, why is it necessary for us to look to some historical location or city? This may be a location or a city yet to arrive.
You are correct. Now had a great point. This could be some entity that's not even on the map yet, and hands down, right? I mean, 70-some years ago, you didn't have an Israel. So our globe changes. You had the globes out, the countries change constantly. So now there's a Czech and there's a Slovakia. Anyway, so we don't know. You're right. And that's a good point. And I think at the end of the day, there's some type of entity here that's going to have unbelievable influence.
Is it before or after the great earthquake?
We will. No, we'll talk about the timing later. I'm gonna punt on that one because it really fits with the later part of 17 and 18. Well, let's go back to the text. If you're not confused already, we don't have all the answers, and anyone who does, run like the wind. You say, well, then why are we studying this? Because the book has a blessing, because it forces us to be in the Word. It forces us to depend on the Lord. It forces us to walk in humility. And that's, they're great minds that espouse any one of these views. And I know some of you in this room hold to a preterist view, and others probably would hold maybe even to a modern Iraq. Some of you may embrace the Roman Catholic Church. Some of you would be appalled that someone would say it's the Roman Catholic Church. But at the end of the day, there is some entity that is going to be used ultimately by the Lord. In fact, even her destruction, look at this. Look at verse 17. 17. We'll get to this, but I want you to see this. For God has put into their minds, who's they? The Antichrist, the nations, to carry out whose purpose? His, by making a decision to give their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And he's even going to put it in their hearts to destroy the beast, the harlot. He'll take care of the beast. But all of this. Well, let's go back, because we're not done with this great prostitute. And I want you to see a few other things here. There's three things noted about the harlot, I think, in the text. The first of these is the location. Where does John go to see her? Into the wilderness. Now, some argue it's the wilderness because he's kept in safety, and then he's revealed this. Others argue, no. The harlot lives in the wilderness. And if that's the case, it reminds me of Isaiah 21. Turn to this text. This is it's really good. Isaiah 21, because I think this is what we have going on here. 21, verse 1 of Isaiah, the oracle concerning the wilderness of the sea as windstorms in the Negev. That's southern modern Israel. It's all desert. We don't usually take groups there because not a whole lot to see. It is beautiful, but it's very barren. And a harsh vision has been shown to me. The treacherous one still deals treacherously, and the destroyer will destroy. And then look what it says in verse 9. Now behold, there comes a troop of riders, horsemen in pairs, and one said, Fallen, fallen is Babylon. She's in the wilderness. And all the image of her gods are shattered on the ground. And I would argue this wilderness is more of an idea. This is where she is abiding God's sense of wrath and judgment. The wilderness can also be a place of purification, but it also can be seen as a place of great suffering. And also, not only is she in the wilderness, but we see that she's sitting on the beast. Again, a sign of influence, a sign of control. And as I mentioned there in your notes, the beast wears scarlet, and so does she. Some have said the red is the sign of the blood. It could be simply of royalty and of power. That's what they wanted to put on Jesus, was a scarlet robe. We also see her appearance. I love this photo because it's really how she looks great on the outside. She is adorned to the hilt, isn't she? Elegant and luxurious attire. Notice what it says, right? Adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. Remember the parable of the kingdom in Matthew 13? The merchant went long and hard because it sold everything to buy this pearl. Pearls and gold were seen as rare commodities. And she's adorned with it. Think of 1 Timothy. How is a godly woman supposed to present herself? It's more on the inner beauty, right? And it's the very thing she lacks. She's not the only woman, by the way, in Revelation. Remember, we met another woman who symbolized Israel giving birth back in 12, and we'll meet another woman in the end of 19, and that's the bride, which is us. We'll get there, all right? But this woman is not like any other godly woman because it's all outward appearance. And so we see here, and then she has a unique prop. We're told not only does she have great attire, but she holds a gold cup. And the gold cup, as you know, is full of what the Lord disdains. It reminds me of Jeremiah 51, the text we read earlier, though that's more of the wrath of God's cup. And we see that, by the way, in 16 verse 19, it says the wine made of God's Babylon has been given the cup filled with the wine made of God's furious wrath, or go hand in hand. The sin, the detestable things is what is the reason God is unleashing his wrath on this woman. It's horrific. She's not afraid to flaunt her sin, is she? This is one wicked lady. Again, symbolic of an entity of some sort. And she has a revealing tattoo, which we talked about there in verse 5. She's known as Babylon the Great, and we mentioned 6 times. Just in this small section, Babylon will be known as the city, the great city. And she isn't just any prostitute. She is the mother of prostitutes. What does that mean? She's the mother of prostitutes. What does that imply?
There are other prostitutes.
She has children. Well, there's a father. Yeah, we won't go there. There are a lot of them. Yes. But she has offspring, and she is nurturing them. She's bringing them up in the ways of Satan, not the things of the Lord, right? The evil activities and the detestable things of the earth. She has a cup with detestable things, and she has a name that's detestable as well. And the mystery here, I believe, and I mentioned this there in your notes, the mystery is that we now see her being revealed. And that's how mystery, that term is used elsewhere in the New Testament. And the church is a mystery. You won't find it in the Old Testament. A new dispensation that God has moved. So we see her location, we see her appearance, and finally, we see her activity. And as Paul mentioned, it's pretty grotesque that she is drunk with the blood of the saints. I have there a quote from Osborne in his commentary on Revelation. He says, the metaphor of being drunk on blood occurs often in the Old Testament. It's a familiar term, a phrase. You don't think about that, but it's used several times. He says, and also in ancient writings. It pictures the great joy with which depraved armies would slaughter entire families as well as opposing armies. They didn't just kill, they delighted in doing it, and they did it horrifically. That's what we're saying here. She went after those who would not bend their knee to the beast. Those who would not receive the mark of the beast, she went after. Which tells me many will die in this time frame for the cause of Christ, right? It also tells me there are many who will not bend their knee in the time of the great harlot. Pretty significant, isn't it? Well, questions on these 6 verses? I know we're leaving some questions unanswered yet, and that is, when is she destroyed? How does this fit in the timetable of the tribulation? We're going to answer those. That keeps you coming back. But we'll get to those. And I think that will also help with identifying this harlot. At the end of the day, who is she? I don't know, but she has some type of, she's a city with unbelievable influence globally, not just regionally. Yeah.
You skipped over the beast.
The beast, yes.
How does that beast relate to the one in chapter 12?
It's the same one. I think this is the Antichrist, the beast who has 7 heads and 10 horns, and that's because we're going to deal with him as we move in 17 and 18 as well. In fact, later part of 17, John explains all that for us. So we'll get there. But I do believe back in chapter 13, this is the same beast. This is the Antichrist. So she props him up. She controls him, so it would seem, but he'll turn around and he will destroy her. No honor among thieves. Well, gesundheit. Any others?
David Patterson says that any first century reader of John's Apocalypse would know the reference to the 7 hills, since almost every inhabitant of the empire knew that Rome was the city of the 7 hills. He then goes on to ask the question, which is what I wanted to ask. He says, one must ask the question, how would first century readers have understood the text? And he goes on to say there can be little doubt that they would have understood it to be Rome. Do you agree with that perspective?
Okay. Paul's quoting from Patterson, who is a futurist, takes a futurist interpretation of the book, and argues that when you see the 7 hills, which we'll again deal with next week, it has to be Rome. That's how a first century reader would take it. There are some scholars who argue, no, they would not have necessarily understood that in Asia Minor. I totally disagree. In fact, the Roman Empire minted coins, some with 7 hills on it, with Roma sitting on top. So would they have known that? Yes, that's how the city was known. So I would agree with Patterson there. I think this reference to the 7 hills, immediately they're thinking Rome, and I think that's what Peter does in 1 Peter 5. He doesn't use Rome's name. He uses Babylon, which is a way to stick Rome, but also indicate as awful as Babylon has been to us as followers of Yahweh, so is Rome. And I think that's what's going on here. And that's why I see the writing of Revelation post-70, during the time of Domitian, who goes after the church. It's the second major persecution of the church. And it just fits. To me, if it doesn't fit with the time of Nero, I think you've got to move it to Domitian. But anyway. Well, so what? You know, you read this and you're going, okay, that's nice. And I thank the Lord that I hold to a pre-trib view, and that I am not going to be there when she's around killing the saints. And it's a bit of a downer, isn't it? I mean, you're going, oh, this is just awful. And there's 3 things I want us to walk away with. First of all, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to hurry. First of all, is that evil is real. It's not an illusion or part of a fictional story. Ephesians 6 says, hey, you got to put on the armor of God. We're dealing, this is a horrific time. And sometimes, I don't know about you, you forget that we're living in a cosmic battle here. Satan would love to destroy the church, and he's doing everything he can. Why target the Christian who's already, not walking with the Lord? Go for the ones that are walking for the Lord. Those are going to be the ones you want to take out. So be on guard. And Ephesians 6 says, hey, we got to pray. with everything in us. And you can look at that text. Here's another reminder, I think, in this. And even in the midst of the harlot's unprecedented persecution of the saints, there will be individuals who remain faithful to the Lord. Many will die in the tribulation period. May the Lord grant us strength to live unashamedly for him. 1 Peter 5 says, listen, Satan is a roaring lion. You know, you got to be careful. I mentioned not another text, but look at 1 Peter. Let's just do this. I know I'm running over. Bear with me. There is not enough time now. I'm struggling. 1 Timothy 5, 8 and 9, it says, be sober and alert. Don't be drunk like the world. Be sober, because the enemy, your devil, is like a roaring lion on the prowl. Resist him. Watch this next verse. Strong in your faith, because you know that your brothers and sisters throughout the world are enduring the same kinds of suffering. Isn't that a great reminder? And not only now, but in the future. And that's what Revelation is just kind of a stand fast. And then finally, we need to remember the victory is already ours. The harlot is not a surprise to the Lord. He knows full well who she is, and he knows full well he's already orchestrated her end. And 1 John 4:4 is an absolutely incredible passage. I just got to read this to you, and then we'll close with this. 1 John 4:4 says, you are from God, little children, and have conquered. You've won. It's already done. It's as good as done. The Lord knows the end. He is victorious. And we will talk more in the next several weeks when we move through 17 and 18. Then why even do this? We'll get there. Let me pray. Father, thank you for your word. And again, there's much we don't understand. But we are so grateful that you do. You've written the plan. You know A to Z. And Lord, we ask for your grace, your mercy, and strength as we attempt to live for you in a world that desperately needs you, but longs to not have you. They would love nothing more than to destroy your name and your people. So allow us to walk in grace, give us boldness, and give us clarity as we engage those around us. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, again, you'll get an email this week about the fall event. Love to have you. Thank you to the Iron Man for the visit. We'll see you, Lord willing. There's more of these flyers. We'd love to have you register for that event.